1 second for those of you on the phone. I mean, one thing I'll say, since I won't I won't need to say this later, I want to give you all just a tiny bit of a background on Bob Alvarez, because he's one of the most interesting people I know in terms of his background. The only person I know with extensive experience in the nonprofit world, in the U.S. Congress, and in the U.S. executive branch, which gives him a set of insights on issues which are truly rare. Bob was a senior policy advisor to the Secretary of Energy between 1993 and 1999. And there he, among other things, coordinated the effort to enact nuclear worker compensation legislation. So that was in the executive branch, Department of Energy. Prior to that, he served for 5 years as a senior investigator for the U.S. Senate Committee on Governmental Affairs, chaired by Senator John Glenn, and he was one of their major staff experts on the U.S. nuclear weapons program. And before that, he was one of the people who helped found and direct the Environmental Policy Institute. So from those different vantage points, he has become one of the leading experts in this country, both on nuclear weapons and on nuclear power. So we're really pleased to have him here at IPS, and Noel Ortega, who's here with us at IPS and who's helping handle the technical sides of this. Let me just ask you, Noel, where we are and what you need before we get started in. Are we okay?
I think we're good. We could continue using the...
We can just use the phone. Okay. So, and can those of you on the phone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
yes.
Wonderful.
Good morning, John.
So, yeah, morning. It's great to have you all. Yeah, so I'm John Cavan. I'm the director of IPS. I'm going to interview Bob here for about 25 minutes on Fukushima 3 years later. Then we're going to open it up to questions and conversation from people who are here with us in the IPS conference room and those of you on the phone. Those of you who are on the phone, you might just want to mute yourselves by hitting *6. And when we get into the questions and discussions, you can unmute yourself, if that's okay. Okay, so we're going to start right in. As you're listening to this, jot down any questions you might have, because there will be an opportunity to ask Bob questions on this. Okay, so here we are. 3 years after Fukushima. I was mentioning to Bob beforehand that I'll never forget the moment I was driving in to get my car washed 3 years ago, just after the horrible earthquake, tsunami, and was just beginning to sink in that this had a major implications for this nuclear power plant in Japan. And on the radio came Bob Alvarez, who understands how nuclear power plants work and don't work. And he gave a fascinating explanation 3 years ago. And here we are 3 years later. And I think we're all hoping that this anniversary provides an opportunity for the people in Japan, people around the world, to really talk about the issues here. I want to just start in with Bob by saying, asking him, what do we know now about what happened at Fukushima in terms of the causes of the accident and in terms of the safety lapses? Bob.
Well, just to go over some of the things that did happen is that on March 11th, 2011, there was a very large earthquake in the vicinity of the Fukushima site. It was registered a 9 on a Richter scale. It was virtually unprecedented in its size and created an enormous tsunami or tidal wave that where the earthquake itself created a significant ground motion that affected the site. There are 6 reactors at the site, 4 of which were operational, well, more or less operational at the time. The site was essentially inundated by a tsunami of about 19 feet, 46 feet rather, 46 feet, that had the effect of essentially flooding the backup power station, power and and overwhelmed the seawall. When that happened, you had what was called a station blackout. The site was without electricity, without backup power, and so when that happens and the reactor is operational, or even when they try to shut down a reactor, the reactor still contains a tremendous amount of radioactivity that gives off a form of thermal heat through the decay of the radioactive materials. Because there was no ability to pump cooling water through the reactor cores, the water overheated, evaporated, and the cladding around the reactor fuel itself, it's a very thin cladding made of an alloy of zirconium, heated up. And zirconium is a very reactive metal. So it reached a point where it began to essentially undergo a form of rusting called hydriding. And at the same time, the cladding surrounding the fuel, your highly radioactive fuel pellets, also was interacting with the remaining heat that was in the core and propagating large amounts of hydrogen. Because there was no ability to pump out this hydrogen gas because of the lack of power to push it out of the containment, actually they had to release the hydrogen gas into the fuel bays, where the reactors, at least 3 reactors underwent, 4 reactors actually, had significant explosions. The most severe explosion occurred in reactor number 3, but there were also hydrogen explosions that pretty much destroyed the reactor buildings themselves, and then subsequently this led to exposure of the spent fuel pools to the open air. The spent fuel pools are about 100 feet above ground, and the reactor core started to undergo meltdown and take the form of what they call corium, and started to, because of the tremendous decay, heat, and fissioning, it continues now when you lose your cooling capability, started to melt down to the reactor mat and into, it isn't like one big blob, but in finger-like structures started to penetrate down into the reactor mat and further down. Eventually, the reactor operator, which is Tokyo Electric Power Company, their only recourse was to run seawater through the cores. This is sort of what I describe as a Hail Mary effort. And in doing so, they at least were able to quench some of the overheating reactor cores, but by this time, these reactors were lost to any further use, and the reactors were already in a meltdown mode, and the site went without off-site power for a period of at least a week or a week and a half before it could restore off-site power. During the course of those events, a significant amount of radiation was released to the air and to the water. The exact amounts are still, well, I think that the jury's out as to the exact amount that was released in the air and the water, but over time, the amount of radioactive materials that was released to the air was, I would say, roughly in the ballpark of the Chernobyl accident. Now, in terms of what we know about why something like this happened, which is, I think, a very important issue, is that you have to look at the history of the construction and the design decisions that were first made about this reactor. These reactors were designed in Albany, New York, by the General Electric Corporation. They were what are called turnkey operations. They were designed and constructed by the Abasco Company, another U.S. firm, and turned over to Tokyo Electric Power once the design and construction was finished. It's sort of the thought of, building a car and giving the key to the driver, the turnkey operation. It's a boiling water Mark I reactor. We have 22 plants in the United States of a similar design. The accident revealed several important vulnerabilities from the perspective of that early stage. For example, the height of the cliff to water was significantly reduced to allow for access to the shore. In order to construct this reactor, they had to essentially reduce the height of the cliff, which was an important barrier against the tsunami. The backup power diesels were placed in the basements without waterproofing. The emergency pipe and service pumps were placed on the shoreline and were not designed to be flood-proof. The diesel fuel plants were on the floodplain. And this reactor type was long known to have a faulty containment, too small for severe accidents. This had been known for quite a while. And the spent fuel pools have no defense in depth and were elevated 100 feet above the ground. When I mean to say defense in depth, they do not have the extra containment of thick concrete and steel above them as reactor vessels do. You do not have backup supplies of water or electricity if something goes wrong with them. And they're elevated, which creates a problem. All these decisions were made mostly by design engineers in Albany, New York, who did not pay attention to some basic and elemental things. One of them was that the reactor designers and constructors did not heed the well-documented history of tsunamis in this area. Had they bothered, they would have learned that as late as 1954 and 55, there were 3 tsunamis that were about the size of the tsunami that hit the reactor in 2011. And that there are records of tsunamis that go back to 1896. They had a tsunami in 1896 that was 131 feet. In 1923, 43 feet. In 1933, 92 feet. 1942, 92 feet. The seawall was constructed to be 19 feet tall. And these are decisions made essentially by engineers and design teams in Albany, New York, without any question about, and without looking back and saying, well, are these designs really suitable for this location? And they just, this to me was sort of, if you want to look at root causes, this is sort of a key aspect of the root cause.
Well, I'm wondering, Bob, I mean, you did mention this chilling fact that came out that there are 22 plants like this in Brooklyn. So let's get to that later. It'd be helpful if you could say a little bit about the impact of this accident, though, on the people in the area, on the food, the plants, and what's that look like 3 years later?
Well, as I said, the containments of these reactors failed by the detonating shock wave of the explosions that released this radioactivity into the air, and that the radioactive gases that might have been leaving at a rate of 300% a day instead of 101% assumed by the designers. So you had a 300% larger release than assumed. A radioisotope, a short-lived isotope called xenon-133, which is very radioactive, was found to be 400,000 times than normal in the city of Chiba. For 8 days, people were likely to be heavily exposed in Chiba from just this short-lived isotopes. Radiation levels of xenon-133 were 30,000 times the background in these detectors near Chiba. And so they were getting a yearly dose in about 10 minutes. In November of 2011, the Japanese Science Ministry reported that long-lived radioactive cesium, this is the real bad actor in this. cesium-137, cesium-134, but principally cesium-137 is easily volatilized when it undergoes these kinds of severe events where you have meltdowns and explosions. And it has a half-life of about 30 years, and it behaves as if it were potassium in the environment. So it is assimilated as if it were potassium in any biota, food, plant life, and continues to be uptaken in the environment. Cesium-137, for example, at Chernobyl really remains the bad actor there. There you have an area roughly the size of half of New Jersey that is uninhabitable because of cesium contamination. It's just simply a forbidden territory. The Science Ministry reported that long-lived radioactive cesium had contaminated about 11,580 square miles.
How does that compare to the Chernobyl one?
Well, it's the level. Well, let me finish the
I think you're jumping.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you're jumping here because this is the area that was contaminated. The area that was contaminated to the level of severity that basically rendered the area uninhabitable was smaller. And so the area that was widely contaminated was roughly the size of Connecticut. All the land within 12 miles of the destroyed nuclear power plant, encompassing an area of about 230 square miles or 600 square kilometers, an additional 80 square miles or 200 square kilometers located northwest of the plant were declared too radioactive for human habitation. The cordon sanitaire, or the forbidden territory around Chernobyl, is about 1,000 square kilometers. So this is roughly comparable to the area, slightly less than that which was created by the Chernobyl accident.
Mind you, it's on the coast.
Right.
So half the Arctic is ocean.
Yeah, so and a great deal of the radioactivity blew out to the sea. And so that was at least an important distinction that had it been more inland, the contamination would have been far more severe. About 159,128 people were displaced due to the contamination. Many of these people have not been able to return. Their homes, many of these homes have mortgages on them, and people have to pay mortgages, etc. The whole business of trying to compensate homeowners is very much tangled up in the bankruptcy or the transition of TEPCO to being taken over by the government. It's still a very messy situation. One of the things the Japanese government did, which I thought was, in my opinion, beyond the pale, is that they changed the goalposts in terms of what they considered to be a safe level of radiation to promote return to these uninhabitable places. And they raised the permissible limit to 20 millisieverts a year exposure. This is about approximately 100 times more than the United States allows for its citizens. So, and for children in schoolyards, playing in the ground, playing in the dirt, this is a very serious matter. And that this is roughly what this is precisely the dose that the International Commission on Radiological Protection is recommending for annual exposure to radiation workers. So they simply changed the goalposts. And it was done, by the way, on National Children's Day in Japan, which I found to be a rather bitter irony. Now, there's also been some studies, preliminary studies of wildlife. I think it's very important to understand that some of the first signal indicators of biological damage is what's happening to the wildlife in these contaminated areas. And Tim Mousseau and his team at the University of South Carolina who've done a considerable amount of work at Chernobyl, have done some preliminary work. They've published a few papers now about what they found in the vicinity of Fukushima. What they found was that most organized organisms showed significantly increased rates of genetic damage in proportion to the level of exposure to radioactive contaminants. Many organisms showed increased rates of deformities and developmental abnormalities in direct proportion to contamination levels. Many organisms showed reduced fertility rates. Many organisms showed reduced lifespans. Many organisms showed reduced population sizes. The biodiversity appears to be significantly decreased. Many species appear to be on the path of local extinction. Rousseau's colleagues in Japan begged him to not have their names appear on the papers for fear of retaliation.
Now, yeah, I know. I mean, first of all, could you say a little bit about what it would take to stabilize and remediate the site?
Well, now we're getting into uncharted territory because we've never had any accident other than the Chernobyl accident this profound occur. You know, right now the cores of reactors number 1, 2, and 3 have melted down through the bottom of the reactor vessels and continue to produce large amounts of radiation and heat. Each day, about 400 tons of seawater are poured on the melted cores, which flow in the nearby reactor turbine building.
It's just fresh water
now. No, that's groundwater. The groundwater, that's 400 tons of groundwater. It's then pumped through an extensive cooling system that traps the radioactivity in filters the size of small cars, which become highly radioactive and are being placed in a nearby field. This highly contaminated radioactive liquid is stored in some 1,000 tanks on the site, and the groundwater continues to flow through the site, flushing the radioactivity from the contaminated reactor buildings. TEPCO, with the help of the Japanese government, is attempting to build essentially a wall that would be frozen with cooling coils on the outer edges of the site to try to block the flow of groundwater coming into the site to prevent this constant flow of contamination. What this means is that this contamination is sort of going on a continuous basis into the Pacific Ocean, and it adds more and more to a plume that is predicted now to reach the west coast of the United States in the near future. There are no credible disposition paths for this enormous and growing volume of stored contaminated water. This is an unprecedented situation. What are we going to do with all this water piling up in these tanks? No technologies currently exist to remove the severely radioactive melted cores. We can't rule out the possibility of permanent entombment of the reactors there. In other words, you cannot rule out the possibility that this is going to become a nuclear national sacrifice zone, where only triage can be done to reduce the contamination.
Okay, and then I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll open it up for others here, which is, you did mention the 22 plants in the U.S. that are of a similar design. What are the implications of this for the U.S. plants, and what's happened?
Well, there are two important implications, I think. One is the fact that these Mark I reactors have undersized containment vessels. So if an accident does happen, they get so overpressurized that they cannot contain this tremendous amount of gas that will be generated, and so that they worked around it by putting what they call wet well vents on the bottom of the reactor core in this country. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is calling for them to be hardened. But that in and of itself is not a good solution, because you also have to be concerned about the possibility of a station blackout. If a reactor, let's say there's a reactor on the Hanford site in Washington State near the Columbia River. Recently, a dam that's upstream from the Columbia River is found to be bulging and having a 65-foot crack 2 inches wide. One of the things that would make me a little nervous is if they had to, if that dam were to undergo a major failure, and they had to and the amount of water that would dramatically flow downstream may not hit the reactor, but it might hit the switch yards that provide power to the site. And then, in which case, you have a station blackout condition. So then you have to make sure, you have to be worried about the backup diesel generators and the batteries, and whether you can retain or you can restore power before the worst case happens. The second sort of design issue of concern is that these reactors have elevated pools. There are different iterations of the General Electric boiling water reactors. The Mark 1s and Mark 2s all have elevated pools. We have about 31 of these reactors in the United States. Unlike the spent fuel pools at Fukushima, our reactors have high density compaction. We have 4 to 5 times more spent fuel in them than the original designs intended. My colleagues and I, about 10 years ago, published a paper warning that an act of malice or an event like an earthquake that could cause water to drain from these pools could lead to a catastrophic fire and could result in land contamination that would render an area uninhabitable approximately 60 times greater than that created by Chernobyl. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has required that these wet well vents be hardened. And that's really the main thing they've done. They recently came out with a report indicating that there's no need to thin out the pools to reduce the contents of the pools in the United States. But there was a dissenting opinion, and that I'm just going through my notes here because all these things are hard to keep in my head. But yes, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on January 6th considered it safe to continue storing most of the spent fuel in pools, even though concerns remain about potential attacks and terrorist attacks. However, there were 2 staff dissenting views. And one of the reviewers who looked at this, who did not concur, pointed out that the approach taken was taken for reactor accidents, not spent fuel pools. And he pointed out that these approaches are not well suited for making this determination for spent fuel pool accidents. Spent fuel pool accidents in high-density pools can contaminate very large areas, displacing millions of people and requiring extensive protective actions. This comes from the staff of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. There are people at the NRC whose light bulbs are on about this. At the heart of the matter is the most consequential vulnerability associated with nuclear power plants is not the reactor. It's the spent fuel pool because of the magnitude. For example, I came across a document that is used by the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission's Emergency Operations Center for emergency responders. And it basically is a model or a code that's used if you have certain basic information to give you an idea how severe an accident might be. It's called the RASCAL code. It's an acronym. I don't remember what it all means, but it was one of these workbook type documents where they sort of instruct you as to how to use this RASCAL code. And they gave you a problem, and one of the problems was to the effect that you got a call from the San Onofre staff, the reactor in Southern California. They've had a major earthquake. The water is draining from the pool. The roof has been torn off. They expect a full drainage in a matter of 2 or 3 hours. what do we do? And so, you know, the book sort of, the workbook tells you, you know, how to press this box and click in these numbers and do whatever. And then at the end, the book gives you the answer. The answer is that such an event would release about 36 megacuries, 36 million curies of cesium-137 into the atmosphere, and that everybody within a 10-mile radius would receive life-threatening doses of radiation. So even within the NRC, there is this sort of understanding about the magnitude of these risks. We've been arguing to thin out these pools for years and years, and I think the major reason has to do with the NRC bowing to the economic motivations of the reactor operators rather than to proper waste management and public safety.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, so for those of you joining by phone and webinar and then folks in the room, let's open it up now. We've got 25 minutes for discussion. So what I'm going to do first, if anyone on the phone wants to ask a question, just shout out your name and I'll take a list of you. You'll have to unmute yourself. So anyone on the phone want to ask a question? Shout out your name.
Hi, this is Karen Carmen. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Karen. Okay, hang on 1 second. Don't ask it yet. Anyone else on the phone? Okay, we're going to start with Karen, and then if anyone here with us at IPS would like to ask a question, go ahead. So Karen, go ahead.
Okay. I understand that one of the Fukushima reactors was running on MOX fuel. Which one was it, and how did that impact the whole situation?
The question was one of the reactors was using had in its core some fuel that was mixed with, it's a blend of plutonium and uranium called MOX. And plutonium is very, very much more radiotoxic than, let's say, uranium. Reactor number 3 is a reactor that had that quantity of MOX fuel. They were doing a sort of a modest test batch, and it was a relatively small amount of MOX fuel. And so the likelihood that any large amounts of plutonium escaped are not very high compared to the cesium that escaped.
Okay. Yeah, here, Ethelbert Miller. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to know if you could talk about the biological damage again and the size of the organism, and plus that affected the organism in water and that organism on land.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I guess the term you use here is radiotoxic. Radiotoxic means that the material is toxic from its radioactive properties in and of itself. And this toxicity takes the form of, in very high exposures, it can cause death of cells and entire organs or organisms outright. But the ones that are of more concern when you're talking about spreading this out over a large population of people and critters and plants really have to do with the mutational impacts. And some of these impacts, well, the so-called somatic mutations that are very well recognized essentially are cancers. And radiation-induced cancer seems to have a latency period, depending on the type of cancer, ranging from 10 to 40 years. We have found that radiation workers who were chronically exposed to ionizing radiation, especially in the U.S. nuclear weapons program and elsewhere, tend to show these increased risks. There have been studies of 14 populations in the United States of nuclear weapons workers that show increased risks of cancer and other diseases following exposure to ionizing radiation. For that reason, the United States government has established a compensation program for U.S. weapons workers, and thus far, more than 100,000 sick workers have been granted over $10 billion in compensation. So the other impact, which is much harder to sort of grasp and to quantify, are these what are called lasting genetic mutations. Right. What does this mean when you start to pass down adverse genetic mutations in subsequent generations? The key indicators to this really at this point in time are the wildlife effects studies that are being done that are indicating that the fauna and the flora are being impacted. What this means for humans is not well defined. The Radiation Protection Establishment of the United States considers these mutations not to be significant, but to be a risk, although they don't necessarily consider it to be a high risk. There's a dispute over this because it depends on what you consider a mutation. There are some geneticists who believe that what are called mild mutations, which are more subtle than the ones that have been observed, let's say, in laboratory settings with fruit flies and other critters, may have a profound impact.
Got a question over here?
Hi, my name is Toby and my question is, what did they find in Chernobyl when it came to the genetic mutations, specifically in humans and large animals?
They found there was one study done of several children who were exposed, and they found that these children had significant lasting genetic mutations. There were not of the nature of the kind where the cell sort of somehow repairs itself and returns to its normal function. They have found lasting genetic mutations in the fauna and flora in a significant level in Chernobyl. This has been largely due to the work of Tim Rousseau at the University of South Carolina.
I'm wondering, and we'll open it back up for people on the phone in a second here, but I was going to ask you the impacts of the Fukushima disaster on the future of nuclear power, but since you all, several people here, you brought in and others have brought in Chernobyl. Before that, we had the 3 Mile Island accident here in the United States. And this has been an issue, of course. I think for anyone, I'm 58 years old, and I was arrested in college and spent 2 weeks in a National Guard armory over being arrested at the Seabrook nuclear power plant. There are a lot of people whose, you know, this is a long time issue where there's been opposition for decades. But did Fukushima, I mean, Chernobyl was way back in the mid-1980s. Do you think that, yeah, exactly. Yeah, now, but is this the final nail in the coffin of nuclear power in terms of no new plants being built or not? And what does it mean? Will it accelerate the shutting down of the fleet?
Well, I think Fukushima is having a very important major impact on the future of nuclear power. It certainly convinced the German nuclear industry to get out of the nuclear business altogether. Siemens has walked away from it. In Japan, there is a raging debate. There is an unraveling of the consensus in Japan that used to be ironclad in support of nuclear energy, because nuclear energy represented a form of energy independence because of Japan's dependence on outside sources of fuel, and it was bound up with the notion of Japan being, you know, having its own independent power sources. Several former prime ministers, Prime Minister Khan, I'm trying to remember the other gentleman, but mostly, and also from the LDP, are opposed to it and are pushing against it. Current Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has been sort of turning around and is pushing now the original policy put in place in the immediate aftermath of the Fukushima accident was a sort of what you call orderly phase out of nuclear power. He's now calling for that not to happen and is trying to push as much as possible to restart those 48 reactors that are shut down. For China, I think, and the big question is, what does this mean for China, which is essentially has officially stated that it wants to build about 100 gigawatts of electricity from nuclear power. I think China is probably taking stock of this, because I think one of the big lessons of Fukushima is that nations like China and others have to really pay careful attention to, is that the other sort of root cause for this accident was the absence of a meaningful nuclear safety culture in the Japanese government. There was no arm's length relationship between the builders, operators of the reactors, and the regulators. The Japanese government did not draw a distinction between promotion of nuclear energy and regulation of nuclear energy. And they are now in the process of undergoing a painful process of having to establish an arm's length relationship. And they don't have necessarily the staff, the knowledge, people to build this up. This is something that takes quite a long time to build up. We went through this problem in the early 1970s and split off the Atomic Energy Commission, actually abolished it, and created an independent regulatory body, which we now know as the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. While it has its issues, and I have concerns about its relationship with the nuclear industry, it does have has built up a staff with a nuclear safety culture. When you're talking about building anywhere from 70 to 100 additional reactors in the country where they aren't there, you have to think about the safety infrastructure. These are not machine. It's very, very important for a nuclear reactor how you hang a pipe, how you weld a pipe, how you lay down a wire. Where does that wire go? It's very, very important what kind of chemistry you're using for the reactor coolant. It's very important as to how you make the fuel. This is precision, high technology, precision manufacturing with no that's quite unforgiving. I mean, you just can't have spare parts that are bogus. The things that allow fossil plants to operate, it doesn't quite matter where you hang the pipe as long as it doesn't fall from the overhead gallery. That's fine. But it really counts for nuclear power plants, especially if you're dealing with seismic issues, flooding issues. These are very, very complicated machines. They are high hazard machines, but they're considered to have low probability until something very bad happens.
Okay, we've got two more people here with questions, but let me just see, is there anyone else on the phone who wants to ask?
Yes, this is Weinar. Can you hear me?
And Jim Shulman.
Someone on the phone wants to? Did we lose them, Noel?
This is Prajna.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Bob. Can you speak to the health implications for people living in Hawaii and on the west coast of the United States today?
I mean, I think the exposures to people in Hawaii and California are going to be much more dilute because of the great distance, and that you would expect the health problems to be much more significant in Japan than they would be on the west coast of the United States. The problem in figuring this out is that you start to get into certain kinds of number crunching where if you can estimate the number of people who might receive a unit of exposure of radiation and it adds up in terms of a collective dose, then you can do the formulas that might give you the number of cancers that might occur, but that isn't necessarily the truth of it all. I mean, I personally have not been anywhere near as concerned about the effects on the West Coast from the current situation than I have with the people of Japan. Now, having said that, if there is something else that happens, for example, if there's a spent fuel pool fire because of another earthquake, and the pool is holding, maybe cesium-137, maybe anywhere from 10 to 20 times more cesium-137 than was released at Chernobyl, then you have to worry about the plume hitting the western United States.
Okay, we've got a question here from Mr. Kunio Kikuchi.
Yes, my father comes from western part of Fukushima. I've been following this earthquake on March 11th, which was essentially 3 events. One, the earthquake, the large earthquake, then the series of tsunamis. Tsunami is not just a one-time event. There were about 3 or 4 major ones. And then the disaster at Fukushima #1 plant, which is at the coast. I think everybody would be, it would be helpful if everyone can look at a map. And also because this is the 3rd year anniversary, there'll be all kinds of programs in the NHK program, and it is quite independent. I've been watching it, and they show all kinds of situations, including the fact that they need today 4,000 workers a day working at the disaster, the plant site, to clean up and everything else. And one of the problems is finding the workers because their exposure limit would be reached after a while. But one of the things that you mentioned, and I think the facts are still murky, is on the day of the earthquake, did the water system collapse before the tsunami? Did any of the water system fail?
Was it the ground motion?
Yes. See? And the external power failed because some of the transmission lines failed, and then the backup failed. But aside from the fact that the tsunami resulted in the meltdown, the fact we learned is that these plants are vulnerable to any stoppage of cooling water, regardless of the cause, regardless of what causes. Once the water system fails, in 12 hours, the plants melt down. And to this day, we don't know where the corium went because no one can get close to it. And I think that's the sort of issue. And there are quite a few other plants like that in Japan and, as you mentioned, in the United States. And you mentioned how you had a much tighter regulatory system, but in the United States compared to Japan, sort of independent. But I think that they should have had a bigger say when Japan was building these plants. And today, now that the accident happened, don't you think that they have to be, the United States have to be more involved in this cleanup and everything else, because it's a plant that they sort of shoved it to Japan?
I agree with you. I think
Thank
the
you.
United
Thank
States should. First of all, I agree with you with your initial observation that the jury is out as to whether the earthquake itself was what was the root cause of the damage or whether it was a tsunami. I think that that's, because there's a lot of concern that if it was that the earthquake itself, the ground motion caused by the earthquake, damaged the cooling system so it was irreparable and could not provide necessary cooling in the reactor. That really raises big questions about the nuclear power fleet altogether in the United States and Japan. A very big question. And that question is not being answered. In terms of the U.S. role, I think, well, I absolutely believe the United States has a role in trying to help mitigate this mess. But it is not done all that much, other than TEPCO hiring American consultants, and there's also this rather strange codependent relationship that the United States has with Japan on nuclear business, because in the United States, those companies that were designing and building reactors that we now know as Westinghouse and General Electric do not exist in the United States anymore. They are owned, well, Westinghouse is owned by Toshiba. General Electric is owned by Hitachi. And so without them, we would not be able to build nuclear power plants in this country. We have nuclear reactors under construction right now. They're being built by Westinghouse, which is actually Toshiba. And all the major equipment, the reactor components, are being made in Japan. So if the Japanese nuclear program collapses and these reactor vendors get out of the business, the United States essentially have to look at Russia and France for its future in terms of nuclear power. So there is this rather odd codependence. The problem is that the United States does have an obligation to go help and deal with this mess. There is an agreement of cooperation under the Atomic Energy Act called the 123 Agreement, named after the section of the law that could provide for that. But the United States has refrained from doing this, mainly because of the concern of the Obama administration and members of Congress that we will be we'll get stuck having to spend a lot of money in Japan when we should be dealing with our own messes. I mean, I draw your attention to our nuclear weapons program. Right now, the estimated liability for the remediation and waste management of our radioactive waste and contamination for the nuclear weapons program, the liability is estimated to be somewhere between $300 billion to $1 trillion. So there's a lot of pressure to not do that. But I do believe the United States has developed a certain, by virtue of having to deal with these radioactive messes at the bomb plants, it does have a certain expertise and capability. I mean, if for example, having watched the accident as closely as I could during the early period, that one of the pieces of equipment that they were using to pump water into reactor number 4 was essentially a concrete, long extension concrete pump that came from the Savannah River plant at the U.S. Department of Energy. So the U.S. has had a role to play in this, but there's no sort of framework agreement as to how the United States should be working with this. And that, as I pointed out, these reactors were turnkey reactors designed by then General Electric in Albany, New York. But the United States does not consider that to be a sufficient grounds for what I consider to be a moral obligation.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. I'm going to go to, Kitty Tucker.
Isn't it true that no country knows what to do about a nuclear meltdown, and that especially when it's difficult to bring in outside help, at least at Gorleben, Chernobyl, we're at least able to try and bring in people to help remediate what was happening on site. But in that process, they irradiated large numbers of personnel, and the Chernobyl site unpredictably dense and sent out radioisotopes. In Japan, we have 3 uncontrolled nuclear reactions that have gone through the barrier. In some cases, they have shown that they've gone through the barrier. In others, they're not sure where the fission continues. And so given that no country has an answer to these nuclear meltdown issues, I think all reactors ought to be closed.
Well, as I pointed out, is that the technologies simply do not exist to handle and otherwise remove the highly radioactive cores of these reactors right now. We really don't. This is all uncharted territory. So you're right about that. In terms of the costs of the accident, just looking up some of the numbers, is that right now you have to understand that these numbers are a moving target and they tend to move upwards. The current estimate is that for remediating the site is at more than $40 billion in several decades. And based on other serious accidents, time and costs are likely to increase. I think that the likelihood of there being entombment of these reactors with their cores is growing over time. And again, it's the national sacrifice zone scenario. To avoid bankruptcy, Tokyo Electric Power was nationalized with a $12.8 billion taxpayer bailout. The precise value of the abandoned cities, towns, agricultural lands, businesses, homes, property located within roughly the 300 square miles or the 800 square kilometers of the exclusion zone has not been established. Estimates of the total economic loss range from 250 to 500 billion, perhaps $1 trillion. Areas significantly contaminated with radioactive cesium and other long-lived radionuclides can no longer sell or export agricultural crops, and that cost is rather significant. 15 months after the accident, 56% of all fish catches off Japan were found to be contaminated with cesium-137. Fishing continues to be banned off the coast of Fukushima, where 40% of the bottom-dwelling fish, sole, halibut, cod, were recently found to have radioactive cesium levels higher than current Japanese regulations. These are all the costs that have yet to be fully sort of figured out and won't be figured, really won't be until a long period of time passes.
So I want to respect everyone's time here. We said we'd be on for an hour, and we've been on for an hour. I do want to say, since Bob has basically opened up a much bigger conversation here, that one, we've got his work on our website at IPS, at ips-dc.org. Also, Bob is about to have he's written quite a bit for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, but he's about to have a regular column there, so you can follow his work there as well. And we at IPS, my colleague Angelique Bain is here, and she is in charge of putting on a series of these conversations. We have events at IPS every week, and for those of you in the DC area, join us, and you can see it on the events part of our website. But for those of you who aren't, we are going to hold these webinars and conversations about every month. We're going to tie it to events like the anniversary of Fukushima. We're going to do one on the anniversary of, on tax day to get into tax fairness issues. We're going to do one at a key moment in the budget debate about the military budget. So Angelique will be sending you updates and reminders about these. If any of you want, please do let Angelique know. So many thanks to Bob. Thanks to all of you for joining on the phone and by webinar. And thanks for those of you who come in person, stick around and we can continue the conversation. Thank you all.